Good afternoon, everyone. It's time to get started. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Mid-Year Election Changes for Cafeteria Plans. I'm Lauren Fisher, Digital Marketing Strategist at Benefit Express, and I'll be your moderator today. This webinar will discuss cafeteria plans and the parameters surrounding mid-year election changes. The presentation will also include live Q&A throughout the session, so please feel free to ask your questions at any time. Discussion points will include when an employee can make mid-year election changes, permitted election change events, the amount of time an employee has to request a change, referencing the Section 125 plan document, and of course, our live question and answers. A few housekeeping items before we begin. If you missed something, don't worry. We'll be emailing you the recording with the slides after the webinar concludes, usually 1 to 2 business days. I'll be keeping the webinar muted to avoid any background noise. We'll pause throughout for questions. Simply type your question in the box below and I'll read it aloud for you at the end of each section. If we don't get to your question today, we will be sure to email you a response. ERISA attorney Larry Grugin is our presenter today. With more than 35 years experience in employee benefit law, Larry has a wealth of experience in dealing with qualified plans, health and welfare, fringe benefits, and executive compensation areas. Thanks for joining us today, Larry. We're excited to have you. And with that, I'll hand it over to you to get started.
Lauren, thank you very much. This is a very complicated area. And what makes it even more complicated is the IRS keeps on fiddling with it. One thing that's very important to understand is that once you as an employer permit pre-tax contributions under a cafeteria plan, then all these cafeteria plan rules come into play. And this is something it's hard to explain to the average participant and understanding exactly what the ramifications are in having pre-tax contributions. Also, from time to time, the Congress gets involved and changes the rules, adds stuff. In fact, yesterday, the IRS actually changed temporarily many of these rules, allowing changes to these contributions. So at the tail end of the presentation, I added 4 or 5 new slides in regard to what the IRS did in Notice 2020-29, which talks about that. So again, normally when I'll be talking about the major part of the seminar does apply only under certain conditions can an employee change their election. But for a limited time only, during 2020, you as an employer could amend your plan pursuant to IRS Notice 2020-29 and allow employees to change their elections. So I'll be going over that towards the tail end of the presentation, and so you'll understand exactly what you can do. Now, these new changes are temporarily, they only apply to 2020. And as an employer, you don't have to make the changes, and you can pick and choose which changes you want to make. So I'll be discussing exactly what the ramifications of these new changes are. So stay tuned and stay to the tail end of the presentation because I'll be going over that in detail. So let's get started. So when an employer adopts a cafeteria plan, generally elections, if somebody makes an election before the beginning of the plan year, there is called a general irrevocability rule. And as an employer, you have to explain to your employees that once you make that election is good for the whole plan year. And only where there's qualifying events, which I'll be explaining, can an employee change their election, which means change coverages, change amounts, and the law allows 15 different events, which I'll be going over. Now, you as an employer, you have to look at your cafeteria plan document and see how many of those 15 you have in your document. You can do all 15, 10 of the 15, 2 of the 15, or none of the 15. Also, there's other events that permit mid-year election changes. For example, somebody elects dependent care thinking that it related to dependent medical coverage when it's talking about custodial care. And they come back and say, well, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Can I change my election? In those situations, yes, you can. I'll be discussing that. So I'll be discussing the administrative requirements that must be met to implement mid-year elections. Well, but one point is very, very interesting to understand, and this is where your broker comes in and other consultant comes in. Your cafeteria plan cannot allow a change that's not permitted under the insurance contract for any of your benefits. So again, if the insurance company says under these situations we don't allow a change, it doesn't matter what your cafeteria plan says. So you have to be in sync with your insurance contracts to see under what situations you can make changes that are consistent with your insurance contract. So here are the first 7 of these changes. And I'll be going over each one. Change in status. Change in status is getting married, getting divorced, having kids. And in those situations, you can change your election under that. Cost changes, the automatic increases or decreases. Basically, if the changes are small, which you can do, and especially if you make an election at another time and the election and if the increases are small, you don't have to get another election from the individual. That's what that talks about. Significant cost changes. Significant cost changes is a sense if there's a spike during the year, and that spike is generally 15 or 20% or more. Basically, what you can do, you can allow an employee to make changes to their election to elect cheaper coverage or to drop coverage. So many times, for example, the cafeteria plan will have one 12-month period, and then your various coverages will have different policy years. So in those situations, even though you had an open enrollment a month before, you can allow an individual, if there's significant cost changes, to change their election and either drop coverage or, in that situation, to change coverages. Significant coverage curtailment. And I'll be explaining this in the sense that for some reason, the insurance company that you were using, their network just went down south. I mean, and the coverage has changed. So in that situation, you can allow someone to elect out of the coverage if that's the case. Addition or significant improvement of benefit coverages, a benefit package. In the middle of the year, you got a new plan and has significant better coverage. You can allow an individual to elect that new coverage. Also, changing coverage under another employer's plan. You can allow, in that situation, if somebody has a spouse that has a different open enrollment, you can allow that employee to drop coverage and join their spouse's plan. Loss of coverage under a group health plan or governmental or educational institution. That's what we're talking. If somebody loses coverage under Medicaid, they can then join your plan during the year. So these are all changes. The first 7, these are all changes that you can allow an individual, and you can elect none or all of these different events. Now, many of these events that you see here, and I'll be discussing when that applies, may not apply to your health FSA. So that's extremely, and I'll be pointing it out throughout the presentation. Anytime you have a change in cost and coverage, that generally does not apply to health FSAs. And the fine example of that is, let's say somebody elected to participate under a health FSA, and then in the middle of your cafeteria plan year, you have you change health coverages and you start offering a high deductible plan. Well, just because you start offering a high deductible plan does not allow that individual to change their election under the health FSA. So you cannot give an employee a election to drop their health FSA coverage just because they're participating under and had a change in coverage. That's not allowed. Here are the other situations, the other from 8 to 15, HIPAA special events. If somebody loses coverage or has a child or gets married, that person can, again, elect to have coverage during the year. There are different events on that. COBRA qualifying events in the sense that if somebody terminates or has a reduction of coverage, they can change their election, and in that situation, they can change exactly what the coverages they have. Judgments, decrees, or orders, if somebody has a qualified medical child support order. In that situation, they changed their election to allow dependents to be covered under the plan. If you become entitled to Medicare or Medicaid, in that situation, you can drop coverage. That's something you can do. Also, under family medical leave, if you are under a family medical leave, you can change your elections in that. You can drop coverage for those situations. And also for pre-tax HSA contributions, that's a different animal entirely. In that situation, the regulations indicate that that person must be allowed to change their HSA contributions. And especially if you're contributing through a cafeteria plan, they must be allowed to change their contributions at least once a month. So that's different than the other situations. Reduction of hours, if somebody has a reduction of hours and they're a variable hour employees, remember if that person is a variable hour employee, even if their hours dip below 40, they're still covered under the plan. There's a special exception which I'll be covering, where you can an employer can allow an employee, for example, to drop coverage, even though the law says they can continue to have coverage. They come to the employer and said, listen, I can't afford it. Now I'm only working 20 hours a week. I can't afford the premiums. In that situation, you can allow an employee to drop coverage. Also, marketplace enrollment. If somebody is on your coverage and it's marketplace enrollment during the year, you can allow that person to drop coverage. So those are the 15 different events. And again, I just want to emphasize, these are all allowable under the law, but as an employer, you're not required to include any of them. You can pick and choose which events will allow, but again, what you have to do is then put that in the cafeteria plan document and then communicate those events to the employees. So let's look at the first situation, change in status. This is the most common. You can change your election if you have a change in marital status, change in the number of dependents, change in employment status, and these are all events if they occur, and generally if it changes eligibility for coverage. Change in residence is the final example where you move outside the service area of your health plan. In that situation, the employer can allow you then to switch coverages. Also, commencement or termination of adoption. Generally, change in marital status includes marriage, divorce, death, a legal separation, and annulment. Now, legal separation, just remember, is not recognized in many states. It's got to be a court designated legal separation, and many states don't recognize that. Also, change in number of dependents. This is birth, adoption, placement for adoption, or death. In all these situations, you can allow that dependent to leave the plan and change your election. And dependent is defined as a dependent under Code Section 105B, which is basically a qualifying child or qualifying relative. Change in employment status means termination and commencement of employment, strike, commencement and return from unpaid leave, change in work site, change in employer status, causing a change in eligibility. So all these events, in order to be recognized as a change in status, must affect eligibility for coverage. So again, this is extremely important. So if a reduction of hours, for example, doesn't affect eligibility, then again, the employee does not have a right to change their election. Dependent satisfying or ceasing to satisfy dependent status. In this situation, generally, because the change in law, especially for medical, this will only occur, especially in situations where somebody now obtains age 26. In that situation, because that person loses eligibility for coverage when they reach age 26, then the law allows that employee to leave coverage, and that's what that's talking about. So that's when a dependent satisfies or ceases being a dependent. Change in residence. Change in residence, again, in order to be recognized as a change event, is the fact that change in place in residence, and change in residence would have to change the eligibility for health coverage. So now you get transferred to another part of the country. The plan that you had where you were working before doesn't have any network in your area, so then you can allow and drop coverage and elect a new coverage that is basically in your area. So that's what that's talking about. Commencement or termination of adoption of proceedings. In that situation, you can add or again remove an individual, especially if the termination of adoption proceedings, that person is no longer going to be adopted. Now, this is extremely important, and you have to look at this. What we're talking about here, a change in status occurs. A plan is only permitted to make a change that is consistent with the event, which means if somebody is then, if somebody, for example, is a dependent and they're age 26, you basically, what's consistent here is the fact you drop them from coverage. But there's various consistency rules that apply in here. There's a special consistency rule for group and term insurance, special consistency rule for dependent care, one for loss of spouse's dependents eligibility, and a special consistency rule for gain or eligibility in another plan. So here, under group term or life or disability, basically if you have a qualifying event, any change is permitted. It doesn't have to be consistent. So if you have a change in status, then you can actually drop coverage. That's what that's talking about. So it doesn't matter. As long as you have the event, you can change your election under that group term or disability coverage. In regard to dependent care adoption, this rule is satisfied if the election change to account corresponds with change in status. So again, what I'm talking about here is that for example, it could be a situation where the, like we have here, is where the facility closes. So what's consistent, in fact, you can drop coverage. So an employee's or spouse's leave of absence or other change in employment status could trigger this rule where, again, if that person is no longer working, what's consistent in that situation is if you reduce or eliminate your coverage. So that's what I'm talking about there. So employee can cancel accident and health insurance for only spouse and dependent if there's a loss of spouse's dependent's eligibility. An election to cancel coverage for anyone else fails to correspond with that change and may occur a hardship for plans that offer limited coverage. So again, if the spouse or dependent loses eligibility for one reason or another, the only people that, for consistency purposes, your election can affect is a spouse or dependent. Special consistency rule for gain of eligibility for another plan. If you, again, if your spouse has open enrollment at their place of business, then what's consistent there, you are allowed in your plan to drop coverage. That's what that's talking about. So again, if you can join the plan because of open enrollment or because of a special enrollment, what's consistent in that situation is to allow you as an employee to drop coverage and then join your spouse's plan. That's what I'm talking about here. So if one of the four special rules don't apply, under this rule, an election change satisfies the consistent requirement if the election change is an account of and corresponds to the change in status that affects eligibility for coverage. So again, what's consistent, if you have a child, what's consistent in that situation, this consistent rule is you add the child. If that child turns 26, what's consistent is you drop the child. That's what we're talking about here. So in this rule, the change in status event must affect eligibility for coverage under the employer's plan, and the change must be an account of and correspond with that event. So again, if you have a divorce, what's consistent here, you drop your spouse. You don't increase coverage for the former spouse, you drop the spouse. So the change in status event must affect eligibility for coverage under the employer's plan, and gain or loss of coverage eligibility under the corresponding benefit plan will satisfy the consistent requirement. So a change in status that affects eligibility includes increase or decrease the number of employees, family members, or dependents. So again, you have to be very careful and look at an event to see, okay, I've had a change that is covered under the regulations. what type of change am I going to allow that's correspondent and consistent with that event? That's what I'm trying to say here. So again, the election change must be accounted and corresponding to the event. If one type of coverage is lost or gained, then the employer is limited to change the election with respect to that coverage. Other eligible employees also can be added when the spouse or dependent gains eligibility as a change in status event. If an employee was not previously enrolled and change in status occurs, this will allow the employee to enroll in order to enroll their dependents. So again, you have to look at each situation differently to make sure that change you're allowing is consistent with that event. That's what I'm trying to say. All right, let's look at automatic increases and decreases in elective contributions as a result of cost changes. So prospective changes in employee payments corresponding to the change in cost of qualified plan may be automatically applied to all qualified beneficiaries except for healthcare FSAs. Now, what I'm talking about here is, as I indicated before, many times the election or the open enrollment for the cafeteria plan may be for a different period than your other coverage that you offer. So let's say the cafeteria plan is a calendar year and the open enrollment or your coverage for your health coverage is sometime later in the year. But instead of having 3 or 4 different open enrollments, you have one in December. And what they're saying here is that if your renewal is such that the change is not substantial, you don't have to go back and have another enrollment for the employees. They've already elected previously under the cafeteria plan open enrollment that coverage. So again, if the changes are not significant, you as an employer are not required to have another open enrollment for that coverage. So if the cost difference is not significant, the payment election change is automatic. Otherwise, the participant may be able to make an election change. So again, if the increase has not been significant, that election that they made previously will then apply to that renewal. That's what I'm trying to say there. Now, if the cost of benefit options under the cafeteria are significant, so again, you had an open enrollment in December for the cafeteria plan. You have a renewal for medical, and the increase is more than 10 or 15%. What you can do in that situation is allow an employee to make a change. And the change is the fact that if it's significant, they can either elect another option, which is cheaper, or if there's no option that is cheaper, you can allow them to drop coverage. So this is extremely important. So if the cost changes is significant, you can allow them to drop coverage if there's no other coverage available. So the election can be revoked if no other benefit coverage provided is similar coverage. If similar coverage is available, it can be elected, but coverage cannot be dropped. Applies to all qualified benefits except for health FSAs. Now, the plan document must contain the provisions allowing an election change for a significant curtailment of coverage. Now, what is the definition of significant curtailment of coverage? And as it says here, there must be an overall reduction of coverage provided under the plan to constitute reduced coverage. This means increase in deductibles, increase in co-payments, and increase in out-of-pocket costs. So let's say in that situation you had a renewal. And because of changes would happen with your coverage, the employer decided, for example, later in the year at renewal to get coverage with significant, because of cost matters, increases, deductibles, co-pays, and that person elected a few months ago that coverage, but the renewal, the coverage changed. What this is trying to say is that you as an employer can allow that employee to change their election to elect coverage that either is cheaper, So a definition of loss of coverage is a complete loss of coverage of the benefit option, managed care ceasing to be available. An individual losing coverage as a result of annual or lifetime limit, which is no longer true. This a substantial decrease in the medical providers, a reduction in the benefits for a specific type of medical condition, and similar fundamental loss of coverage. And again, if this is the situation, then that person can allow to change their election. Similar coverage is the same category coverage, major medical to major medical. Coverage must be available to cover the same individuals, and the cafeteria plan may treat a spouse and dependents plan as similar coverage, and the cost is not a factor. So it's not an increase in cost, which was the other event, is the actual addition or significant improvement. Participants can elect new or newly improved benefits on a prospective basis, whether or not they previously made an election of the cafeteria plan. So, and at open enrollment later in the year, that employer decided to add another coverage or significant. As an employer, you can allow that individual to change coverages and to elect a new coverage later in the year. Change in coverage of the spouse or dependent under another employer's plan. In this situation, you elected coverage in the beginning of the year. In the middle of the year, your spouse has an open enrollment. What this does is that you can allow an employee, because this spouse got newly eligible for coverage, either because it's open enrollment or there's special enrollment, whatever. You can, in this situation, you can allow that individual to drop coverage and join their spouse's plan. That's what this is trying to say. So again, if you want this event, you have to add it to your cafeteria plan to allow employees to drop coverage in the middle of the year. So 4 types of coverage changes are possible under this spouse's plan. Mandatory changes in coverage initiated by the insurer. Mandatory changes in coverage initiated by the employer's and spouse's employer. Optional coverage changes initiated by the spouse's employer, and changes in coverage initiated by the participant spouse during the open enrollment. What's most common in that situation is the fact that the spouse has a new open enrollment, and your employee has decided to drop his or her coverage to join the spouse's plan. That's the most common situation, and you can allow an employee to drop coverage in that situation. Now, loss of health coverage, what is the most common in that situation is either loss of state children's CHIP program, loss of coverage there because of eligibility. It could be because of loss of eligibility for Medicaid. So again, any of these governmental programs, if an individual lost eligibility, that gives them the ability to join your plan in the middle of the year. That's what we're talking about there. HIPAA special enrollments. In this situation, what is the most common? They gain eligibility for Medicare, Medicaid. 2, they get married, they have a child, or 2, they lose other coverage. In those situations, that allows them to join your plan, and because they got allowed to join their plan, their contributions can be pre-tax. So again, that individual wasn't a member of your plan unless they lose eligibility, unless their spouse lost their job and they lost coverage. In that situation, that individual then, because of loss of coverage, can join your plan in the middle of the year and make pre-tax contributions. The same thing if they weren't eligible for your plan and they had a child or got married. In that situation, that will allow an individual to join your plan in the middle of the year. But again, these are events that you can allow, you don't have to allow. This is very common. And again, generally, there's a 30-day requirement. They have to come in and they have to tell you of the marriage, loss of coverage, whatever. But again, the most common is individual loss coverage of their spouse and they want to join your plan. That's what they're talking about here. Lauren, do we have any questions?
Thanks, Larry. Yes, we do have a question, and this one is from Kathy. If an employee or their spouse becomes Medicare eligible, enrolls in Part A in, let's say, November 2019, stays on employer coverage, then enrolls in Medicare Part B in April 2020, are both qualifying status changes, or is the original eligibility where this person enrolled in Part A the eligibility, or does enrolling in Part B later also make it a qualifying change?
Now, once they enroll in Part A, they have the ability to drop the employer coverage. All right. Now, what's interesting about that? Once they enroll in Medicare, they are allowed to drop coverage. That is not a COBRA qualifying event for the employee, but it's a COBRA qualifying event if the spouse and children lose their eligibility for coverage because they individual drop coverage, which is very interesting. But again, if they enroll in Medicare, they have the ability to drop the employer coverage. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. We do have another question.
Mm-hmm.
So right now we are on slide 33, and this question is from Stephanie. On the previous slide, number 32, we had mentioned you have to allow after-tax changes. Can you please clarify?
Let's look at the previous chain. In this situation, here's what's interesting. The employer has a choice here. Because remember, to be a cafeteria plan, you have to give the employees a choice of cash or benefits. And you have to satisfy that requirement. The employer does not have to allow after-tax contributions if they allow an individual to waive coverage. In other words, each year you can waive coverage. If you do that, that satisfies the cash option, and the employer in that situation does not have to allow after-tax contributions. Okay. Now, some employers say, I'm sorry, but we're going to require you you can't waive coverage. In order to satisfy the cash option, then the employer must, in that situation, allow an employer to pay for the coverage with after-tax dollars. That satisfies the cash option. Okay? That's what I mean by that.
Okay, thank you. Another question. This is going back to the Medicare question previously, and this is from Doreen. To clarify the Medicare answer, if they do not drop ER coverage when getting Part A, can they drop ER coverage when they enroll in Part B, even if a year or two after?
No.
Okay.
Now, they could always drop it at open enrollment. But again, it's the initial eligibility for Medicare. So let's go to COBRA qualifying event. In that situation, that person has a reduction of hours or loses their job. In that situation, that employee has the right to, again, to change coverages, to drop coverages. And it's probably more of a qualifying event if somebody has a reduction of hours. Now, in order for the reduction of hours to be a COBRA qualifying event, you must lose eligibility. So, and what some employers are doing right now, because they're reducing employees' hours, they are keeping them on the plan, and they're waiving the hours requirement. In that situation, if that employer does that and doesn't drop coverage, then it's not a COBRA qualifying event. So the reduction of hours or the termination of employment must affect eligibility for the plan to be a qualifying event. In that situation, that person then, of course, has the opportunity to drop coverage. Judgments, decrees, and orders. The most important example of that is a cafeteria may allow mid-year changed account of orders relating to divorce, legal separation, or changing custody. Also, the most important example is the fact that you have to allow changes and you have to honor the qualified medical child support order. And in that situation, which is interesting here, is that even though the employee, for example, doesn't want coverage, in order to honor the qualified medical child support order, you must add the employee and therefore take money out of their paycheck to pay for that coverage. And that, again, is going to be pre-tax. So again, in order to add the child, the employee must be covered. And because of that, those contributions are pre-tax. Entitlement to Medicare or Medicaid, again, a cafeteria plan may allow mid-year election changes on account of eligibility for the employee, spouse, or dependent for Medicare. Gaining Medicare or Medicaid allows participants to cancel or reduce medical coverage, and losing Medicare and Medicaid allows a participant to elect and increase coverage. So again, in the middle of the year, as I indicated before, if somebody, and in gaining Medicare means they enroll in Medicare, not just being eligible for Medicare, which is extremely important to understand. Okay, extremely important. In that situation, that person in the middle of the year can drop coverage. Now, once they drop coverage, that means that the spouse and dependents will also lose coverage. Because it's a voluntary act, because in most situations, enrolling in Medicare doesn't, if you have 20 or more employees, that doesn't affect your ability to participate under the employer's medical plan. The employer cannot drop you. It's a voluntary act, and therefore it's a qualifying event for the spouse and dependents, but it's not a qualifying event for COBRA for the employee. Extremely important to understand. Family and medical leave of absence. If somebody goes on family and medical leave, they can change their election, and what allows them to do in that situation is to drop coverage when they go on unpaid family and medical leave. Now, what's important to understand, especially under family and medical leave, is the fact that if they drop coverage, there's no coverage during the period of time that they drop coverage, but once they come back active after family and medical leave, then they start up again, and those contributions would be pre-tax. But they have the ability to change their election, drop coverage both for medical coverage and for health FSAs. So again, they have the ability to do that. Now remember, under family and medical leave, an individual is treated as being active. So the employee is charged just the same rate as the active employees are. Now, during if an individual doesn't drop coverage and continues coverage and doesn't pay the premium during family and medical leave, the employer has a right to drop coverage. Now, what's important to understand, if that employee doesn't pay the premium during family and medical leave, the employer, again, I said, can drop coverage, but it's not a COBRA qualifying event. It's not a COBRA qualifying event until the family and medical leave ends. And if they don't come back in that situation, then COBRA can start at that point. Okay? Now, again, many employers sponsor health FSAs now. HSAs now. And many of them are allowing employees to contribute through the cafeteria plan. And that's an additional benefit under the cafeteria plan. And the normal rules do not apply to HSAs. Basically, what the law says, the employees must be allowed to change their elections at least once a month. So they can, and in many employers, they can change at any time. So this is something you have to check your cafeteria plan and make sure you add HSA contributions to it, and just make sure the fact that the employee has the ability to change their elections once a month. Reduction of hours. This generally applies to variable hour employees under healthcare reform. A variable hour employee, if they were full-time previously, during what's called a stability period, they continue to have coverage. And during that stability period, even if their hours dip below 30, they're still eligible for coverage. So this applies to variable hour employees. So even if they're working part-time in the next period, that employer cannot drop coverage. Now, what they've done is they've created a rule for those individuals. You have a reduction of hours less than 30. The employer can allow you to drop coverage if the employee gets other coverage. So they go on the exchange because they're now eligible for credit and subsidy. And again, this is a very limited situation. It only applies to variable hour employees, but this is something the employer can add to their plan. So if you have a reduction of hours and you have coverage, you can drop it. Another important change is the fact that an employer can allow employees to drop coverage and enroll in the marketplace. So even if they've elected coverage previously, when open enrollment happens on the marketplace, you can allow them to drop coverage and then go on the marketplace. But again, they must get coverage on the marketplace. Now, one thing that's very important to understand, even though there's 15 different events that apply to cafeteria plans, only these 5 apply to health FSAs. Anything that applies to cost and coverage doesn't apply to health FSAs. So only change in status, COBRA qualifying events, judgments, decrees, and orders, entitlement to Medicaid and Medicaid and family and medical leave. These are the only events that apply, and you can allow changes to the health FSA. This is a problem because many times employers will have a different policy or plan year for the medical coverage, and they may have a open enrollment for the medical plan in the middle of the year. And that employee previously elected health FSA, and they've elected to go in a high deductible plan. The employer cannot allow an employee an election to drop their health FSA coverage in the middle of the year. Now, what they could do, they could amend the health FSA to be a limited purpose to allow that employee to participate in an HSA, but they cannot give them an election. So anything dealing with an increase or change in cost and coverage does not apply and does not affect your election under health FSA. Now, other events may cause mid-year changes is medical leave under USERA, mistakes by the employer or the employer, employee or the employer. I've seen many situations where, as I said before, an employee has signed up for dependent care, thinking it's money for dependent care or medical coverage. They later realize that it's not for that purpose. They come into the employer and said, I misunderstood, I'm sorry, can I change my election? And when I tell people is that if they come back to you in a month or two and realize their change, you can allow them to drop coverage. But if it's more than that, I would think twice about it. And also, mid-year election changes may be required to pass non-discrimination testing, especially for highly compensated. And in other situations that may cause an automatic loss of coverage will affect your elections. So what you need to do to effectuate all this is obtain substantiation of the reason for the change, decide when the election can be effective, and again, you should be consistent that when that election change is effective, confirm that the cafeteria plan regulations allow the change, and again, confirm that the plan document and the insurance policies do allow that change. before you put pen to paper and you adopt a cafeteria plan, make sure that it doesn't conflict with your insurance policies. Because it's embarrassing to say you can make a change, that event is recognized under the cafeteria plan rules, but you look at your insurance contract and it doesn't allow a change. Many times, especially dental and vision plans, may not have special enrollment provisions. So please look at your documents, please review what they do, and make sure your cafeteria plan is consistent with that. And again, this just goes into detail in regard to that. And again, an insurance policy might not allow a change at all, or might allow only certain conditions. So that's important when you draft your cafeteria plan document, to run it past your broker, review the insurance contracts to make sure they're consistent. This does not have, I just wonder what happened to it. Bear with me a second. Here it is. Okay. Lauren, for some reason, the development section got cut off by your section.
Okay, is this ready to go?
Yeah, it's ready. What I'm saying is that the copy you gave me don't have these, so I'll make sure they're added when I send them back to you.
Right.
No problem. Okay, I found it. Okay, I didn't check it because I didn't have much time. Okay.
Sorry about that. I'm glad we found it.
No problem. Okay, now, as I indicated in the beginning, let's change it here. Yesterday, the IRS released Notice 2029. And what they've done is that for a limited time only, it provides new relaxed rules for 2020 for making elections under cafeteria plan rules. And it applies to both premium only and to dependent care and the health FSAs. So only to the end of the year. So the IRS provides for increased flexibility in respect to mid-year elections under cafeteria plan rules. This notice also provides increased flexibility with respect to grace periods and carryover periods that apply unused amounts. And again, this only applies to the period through December 31st, 2020. Now, here's what this says. Here's what this means. For mid-year elections made during the calendar year 2020, a cafeteria plan may permit employees who are eligible to make salary reduction contributions on the plan in respect to the employer-sponsored health coverage, to revoke existing elections and to make a new election to enroll in different health coverage sponsored by the same employer on a prospective basis, revoke an existing election on a prospective basis, provided that the employee attests in writing that the employee is enrolled, and they can revoke an existing election. So basically, everything I've talked about previously for the rest of 2020 for any, and you as an employer can allow this. You don't have to allow it. So if anybody comes to you, and this is effective now, and says, I really can't afford coverage any longer, or the coverage is too expensive, I want something cheaper, you can allow them to make a new election for a cheaper coverage, or to revoke an election and make a new election for a different plan, or revoke an existing election, provided the employee attests in writing that the employees enrolled immediately will enroll in other health coverage. So despite what I've talked to previously, for a limited time only during 2020, you can amend your cafeteria plan to provide for these new elections. Now, in addition to that, you could revoke an election and make a new election, a decrease an election for any reason for the health FSA and for the dependent care. So if an employee comes to you and said, you know, because of the reduction of hours I have, I can't afford to contribute to my health FSA any longer, or I cannot for any reason continue to contribute for my DCAP, dependent care program. You can allow them during 2020 to make an election change and revoke their election or make a new election, reduce it under the health FSA. So this is the limited time only offer. All right. Now also too, you can, if some monies, for example, if you had a runout period and monies weren't used, and the reason for this, many times the elective procedures, medical procedures were canceled earlier in the year during February, March, and April. The government realizes what, and somebody had a scheduled election, a scheduled surgery, and it's been delayed. So if you had money left over from 2019, you had a runout period, you can allow that person to continue to use that money into the rest of 2020. Very important to understand. Now, the IRS indicated that these amendments are not required. You can pick and choose which ones you want. And you have until on or before December 31st, 2021 to amend your cafeteria, but eventually, and the most important thing you have to do in this situation, I think, is is communicate these changes to your employees as soon as possible. All these changes came out yesterday. So again, extremely important, limited time offer. You can allow employees to change their elections under the cafeteria plan, and all the other events I just indicated do not apply, because they recognize this is an emergency situation. People are suffering, and so they're allowing people to change their elections. And they can, again, on health FSAs, you can allow them now to join plans before they couldn't. So again, you can allow individuals to join your plan, make pre-tax contributions where before you couldn't allow them. So again, this is extremely important to understand and make sure it's communicated. If you need anything in this regard, I have a full explanation that I can send you. So if you need an explanation, that's my contact information. I can send you something so you can send it out to your employees. Lauren, are there any other questions?
Thanks, Larry. Yes, we do have a couple of other questions. I know that we are getting a little bit close to the end time here. So once again, if we do not answer your question live today, you have Larry's contact information, and we will also email you a response. So our first question in this set, Larry, is many of the carriers in our area are allowing employees who previously waived coverage to come on the plan outside of the enrollment period. It's a special enrollment. Would they be eligible to elect coverage as a pre-tax basis?
Yes. Before it wasn't possible, but after yesterday, it is true.
Thank you. Okay, our next question. Are there any scenarios that allow a change or cancellation of healthcare FSA?
I'm sorry, repeat that over again.
Are there any scenarios that allow a change or cancellation of healthcare FSA?
Well, right now, I just gave you, during 2020, for any reason, you can change your election under a cafeteria plan. So this notice 2020-29 for a limited time only during 2020 allows an employee to change their election under a health FSA for any reason. Very important. In regard to the previous question, the first response is the fact that make a new election on a prospective basis. So again, previously, if you let people on to plan which they normally wouldn't be covered, you couldn't do a pre-tax contribution. Starting yesterday, that first bullet allows you to let them on the plan and pay for their coverage on a pre-tax basis.
Okay. Our next question comes from Peggy. If you allow for these election changes, are you also refunding what was contributed into their FSA prior to the change?
No. No.
Okay.
If they drop coverage, they have. It's like insurance. It's these new elections are prospective only.
Our next question comes from Gina. Can an employer now have both a rollover and grace period through December 31st, 2020?
No, it's one or the other.
Okay, and we will end here for the sake of time. And once again, we will email you a response to your questions. We did get quite a few. Here's our last question from Amy. Can employees get their DCAP FSA funds reimbursed?
I don't understand the question. Dependent care, what you can do in this situation is that if your daycare center has been closed because of the pandemic and they're closed down, you can change your election to stop it now. What happens in that situation, it just stops at that point. You can't get reimbursed. You cannot get back what you've contributed to that point. Once you've stopped, any election is prospective. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, thank you. And I think we will end it there, everyone. Once again, we will email you a response to your questions, and everyone will be receiving a recording of this presentation within the next 48 hours. And we would like to thank everyone for joining us today. We hope everyone is healthy and safe. And please keep a lookout in your inbox for information on any upcoming webinars that Benefit Express will host.
Also, just be made aware that a few weeks ago, the IRS and DOL made changes to the rules on special enrollments and COBRA for a period of time. There's going to be a period, the fact that you're not required to receive any COBRA premiums. I'm going to have a seminar on this to explain it, but there's some special rules that came out a few weeks ago, and I'll be having some seminars in regard to that. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, and thank you, Larry, again. Have a great one, everyone.
Mm-hmm.